Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Invincible Army. Today we'll be talking about Invincible Army, who they are, how they play, their strengths and their limitations before jumping into Infinity Army to go through some of the profiles that really showcase the faction. Big thanks to channel supporter Psychical, I think is how it's pronounced, for this request. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. I take video topics from channel supporters and members. Now, just to preface this video, we've been looking at Invincible Army today, but I am not an Invincible Army player. I have played games with Invincible Army, I've certainly played many games against them, but my understanding of this faction is going to be relatively surface level and my opinions will reflect that. We will mostly be looking at how to approach Invincible Army as a newer player, and specifically, we'll be talking primarily around what I would call the first order ways to play them. We are not going to be digging down deep into the possible nuances and the different ways you might be able to play Invincible Army after sort of the obvious and initial way to play them. We'll be focusing primarily on what I consider to be their obvious strengths and their obvious playstyle, because I lack the expertise to really speak to the broader nuances. So bear in mind, this video comes with that caveat. And I mention that because ultimately, and I will really only reflect on this in the video at this point here, I don't think Invincible Army is a strong faction. If you are a player with either a focus on competition or on what I would call playing optimally, you like to play your best game, you like to play to win, even if you aren't being competitive, Invincible Army is probably not for you. White Banner Army or Vanilla Yuching are both better options if you own Yuching models or want to play them, and you have that focus on either competition or playing in a way that is ultimately, at the end of the day, playing to win in some respect. However, I don't think that is because Invincible Army lacks strengths. In fact, I would say Invincible Army has some really clear and defined and kind of well-designed strengths. It's just that they fail to overcome the limitations the faction plays under. And so we'll be speaking to both of those things. We're talking about really what are the strengths, what are the reasons to play Invincible Army, and what you have to overcome if you want to do so successfully. And so, with that said, with those caveats, what are the strengths or reasons to play Invincible Army? And the first I would say is that they have a very, very clear army fantasy, and that is military power armor. Now, specifically what that means is this is not the Knights faction, it's not the Samurai faction or aliens or weeaboos. These are human professional soldiers in power armor. The fantasy of Invincible Army really is of an army of troops in power armor, of military professionals who fight as squads. And that is a vibe that can be really appealing. Like if you have played, actually, as an example, one of the coolest looking Invincible Army lists that I have played against personally did a full Halo themed total conversion, which it turns out is actually very easy. If you just use a Spartan themed color scheme and you print out some Halo heads, the Invincible Army bodies fit Spartans really, really well. That army looked absolutely fantastic. You will occasionally see it around in Australia. One of the Australian players plays Invincible Army themed this way. And as much as it's obviously off narrative, that is a inspiration from an entirely different fictional setting, that idea, right, that theme is very emblematic of the military professional human soldier in powered armor. And if you like that vibe, Invincible Army can be for you. And the army absolutely plays into this well. You absolutely will be taking an army that is primarily going to be comprised of heavy infantry. There will be lots of soldiers in heavy infantry, there will be different types of soldiers in that power armor, and in pretty much every case, the bulk of your list will be heavily power armored human military soldiers fighting together as squads. And so, having delivered on that strength, we can see basically two things that are real reasons to play Invincible Army from a mechanical perspective, two notable strengths. The first is, obviously, you have lots of heavy infantry, and having lots of heavy infantry can be very powerful. If nothing else, your army will just have more wounds and more armor than you will see in an army comprised primarily of light or medium infantry. And that can have serious knock-on effects over the course of a game. The fact that everything will take like a second hit to put down in many cases, or more failed saves, and the fact that you have both wounds and armor means that the resiliency of Invincible Army against conventional firepower really can add up. It is difficult to move in on and engage a heavy infantry link with stuff like chain rifle armed troops or light shotguns, because a whole Invincible Fire team being comprised of armor 3 or 4 models with multiple wounds means they can comfortably risk shotgun template or chain rifle template attacks and respond with ballistic skill attacks back to put down those attackers. It will also tend to just add up over the course of a game as you play the odds. If enough of your army is sufficiently high armor and has enough wounds, you will just make it through fights that you otherwise wouldn't have if you were running a light infantry army. You will survive more failed dice rolls, you will succeed more armor rolls, you'll just take longer to put everything down, you will tend to go the distance or require a lot more force from your opponent to accomplish objectives that they need. If your opponent needs to dislodge you from a position in order to accomplish an objective, it will just take them longer because you have that big, heavy infantry focus. And the second strength that really significantly delivers on that fantasy of military army power armor is orders and link teams, which kind of go hand in hand. Invincible Army really have a focus on often one or more heavy infantry link teams, which they are capable through a variety of skills, both NCO and tactical awareness, of spending a truly prodigious number of orders on. In terms of just count of actions, right, the number of troops that do a certain number of things over the course of a turn, it's actually possible that Invincible Army is literally the high watermark in terms of a maximum number of actions you might take with a list over the course of a game, because you will often be mobilizing a full 5-person heavy infantry link and spending literally the most orders you can spend on a troop in the game, period. The strict upper limit for the number of orders you can spend on an Invincible Army Fire team is 16 orders on a single 5-person team inside a single combat group. Now, there are lists that can spend more than 16 orders total, but 16 orders on the same 5 people is borderline unmatched across the game elsewhere, and is actually a really big deal. Infinity doesn't actually like contemplate or handle order counts of that size that well that often. Like, typically speaking, we play assuming that there is going to be a limit to the number of orders that can be spent on an individual troop. There is a limit to the sheer amount of distance something can cover. This is why fast units are good. This is why dangerous units are good. They can do things more efficiently. And being able to spend, often you won't have that many tactical awareness and NCO orders to spend on a unit. Your usual Invincible Army lists will be a little more moderate than that, but 13 or 14 or even 15 orders on a link team is not unreasonable, and that is literally 50% more in some cases than you might otherwise expect a unit to be able to perform. And that creates situations where usually the percentage of your order pool that might be spent just moving is considerably higher than it will be for an Invincible Army link. You might spend 3 or 4 orders moving across the table, 5, 6 orders moving across the table to accomplish different objectives just to get where you need to go. For a normal link team or a normal infantry trooper, that represents 40, 50, 60% of your total orders for the turn you could spend on that troop. But for an Invincible Army link, it can mean as many as a third. It can mean like that's only 30 or 40% of your total order count, which means that you have that many more. Proportionally speaking, that means you can have literally twice as many orders as your opponent that you can dedicate to attacking. Now, in many cases, because we're talking about big 5-person link teams here, although the opportunity does exist in some cases to just play the Thunderbolt from God and take your heavy infantry link and spend as many orders as you need, moving all the way across to the table to your opponent's deployment zone and then killing everything you can find there, more often how you will actually play a heavy infantry link team in Invincible Army, if you want to play them properly and conservatively and with an eye toward the long game, is not going for the knockout punch. It is reserving some of those spare orders that you will have to pull the link team back to a position of safety. This is good doctrine in Infinity for any piece that represents a significant portion of your total army's strengths. Usually we talk about tags, right? If we're talking about piloting a tag, you want to reserve just a couple of orders at the end of the turn to pull a tag back from its offensive position into a nice safe defensive position so that it's hard to attack, so you will have it again next turn. And the same doctrine applies to Invincible Army heavy fire teams. In general, they will be less mobile than a tag, so you will need to devote more orders to pulling them back. Where you would spend, say, 2 orders to pull a tag back, you'll want to devote something like 3 orders for an Invincible Army fire team, but you have those orders spare, and that's a really big deal. So, if I've just spent all this time saying, well, the Invincible Army is strong because tons of heavy infantry troops, it's durable, it's dangerous, it has all of the pieces you need to prosecute an offense, and tons of orders to wash through those big, powerful link teams, why then do I think Invincible Army is overall a weak faction? And I think that because all of those strengths do not outweigh 2 really significant limitations that are baked into the faction. The first of those is just the composition of the Invincible Army. It's a slightly older sectoral now. It is designed with a very, very clear heavy infantry focus, to the point that the army is really functionally nothing but heavy infantry. There are no warbands, there are relatively few cheap troops. Even your skirmishers are very expensive heavy infantry. This creates a couple of problems. The first is list construction. It's not as bad as, say, military orders, because you do have availability to flash pulse remotes in Invincible Army. But Invincible Army can be a very challenging army to fill all the way out to 15 troopers. The list that we're going to show you at the end of this, for example, is going to be running notably less than 15 troops, and the second combat group will be pretty atrophied. It will really just be a very small support group designed to reinforce orders into the first group as needed. And that has the knock-on effect of kind of diluting some of the advantages that we get from having all of these extra wounds and having all of these extra orders. In total, the total number of wounds in the army, the total number of orders in the army does not as significantly outstrip the competition as we might like. It's just that it's more focused in specific places. And the second issue that this composition of the Invincible Army sectoral causes is a little bit of a all you have is a hammer problem. We have access to, and we will be using, tons of heavy infantry, which we'll be putting in link teams to force multiply them, and that will be pretty much our only problem-solving tool for the bulk of the list. And you had better hope that whatever problem you are confronted by can be solved by hitting it with tons of orders washed through a heavy infantry link team. Now, there are independent operators that you can take in Invincible Army. Some of them are actually really high quality, but they're heavy infantry and they're expensive, and your link teams are going to be expensive. And the more you try and push Invincible Army away from the core of what it wants to do, the more you have to dilute those strengths. And you can, and I suspect, if you were to play Invincible Army competitively, you would have to learn how to flex them away from that core strength. Because to succeed competitively, you have to overcome that issue of only having one tool to solve a problem with. But approaching the faction from first principles and really having a sort of like first order look at what the faction wants you to do on the basis of its design, that is kind of a thing where you just have this one tool and you better hope that your big core link or your other heavy infantry can accomplish something. And that leads us kind of neatly into the second and larger problem with the Invincible Army from a competition perspective, which is that everything is heavy infantry, which means that everything is hackable. Now, you can't actually sort in Infinity Army by non-hackable in Invincible Army, but if you could, you would find incredibly few things that are not hackable in Invincibles. Almost without exception, every single model that you would use to prosecute an offense or accomplish an objective in Invincible Army is going to be hackable. And that is going to cause like serious issues over the course of a 3 or 5 round event. Because if you're playing a one-off game, you might just say, hey Greg, can you just not play tons of hacking today? I don't want to have to deal with running this entire army through a Massamoran link team, Massamoran repeater network with 2 interventors behind it. I don't want to deal with that today. Can we just not do that? And for casual play, absolutely fair cop. But in a 3 or a 5 round event, or even just turning up to the local game store and not asking your opponent to, change what they're playing in order to give you a better game experience, you are going to run into hackers a lot because hacking in Infinity N4 is cool and fun and powerful, and you are very vulnerable to it. Now, there are tools that we can use in Invincible Army to help overcome some of those challenges, and we'll be talking about those. Actually, I will be highlighting over the course of the Army review section pieces and rules that will help you mitigate some of the challenges that you're going to face having to deal with repeater networks. But the core problem remains, and the core problem is your whole army is hackable, and that includes all of the pieces you might use to try and break up an enemy repeater network. And this leaves you in a situation where you are just going to be vulnerable to enemy hacking in a lot of games, unable to outmatch or overwhelm enemy hacking in a lot of games, and potentially unable to maneuver around enemy repeater defenses in a lot of games. And that creates situations like the last game that I personally played against Invincible Army, where a single model, in this case an Interventor killer hacker with Fast Panda, just dooted a Fast Panda out onto the roof of a building and caught an entire Invincible Army Link team inside the repeater area. Now, I then went and attacked that Link team with conventional forces, and I did very little damage. But I surrounded them, and I caught a couple of them in melee, and when that Link team went to activate and try and unpick those problems, every single activation provoked multiple hacking AROs, which they simply could not resist, and over the course of my reactive turn, I bricked an entire 150 point Link, and left it effectively dead in the water in the midfield, spotlight everything as part of that, isolated, immobilized, spotlit, and then just missiled them all to death on my second turn. And that, to me, is the quintessential playing as or against Invincible's experience from a competitive perspective, and something that, if you are a person who wants to jump into Invincibles and you're willing to say, you know what, I'm going to deal with this as a challenge, I'm going to learn how to overcome it, and I'm going to leverage all of those strengths, that is basically the case for Invincible Army from a competitive perspective. If you are willing to bear up under this challenge, right? This problem that anytime you run into a combatant enemy hacking defense, you are going to have to play very effectively around it and accommodate the challenges that it poses. You can access all of the strengths of Invincible Army, and those strengths are pretty cool and unique. And I think, with all of that said, it's now time to jump into the army review section and actually start looking at some profiles, because there is only so much I can say about how hackable this sectorial is before we actually start getting into profiles and talking about, you know what, there are actually some fairly cool things in here. And that starts with our basic line trooper, the Zuyong Invincible Heavy Infantry Terracotta Soldiers. Now, there are an absolute ton of profiles here, but there's a couple that we should focus on, I think, in particular, and which you will use regularly. The first thing, just to note, is that Invincibles is a fireteam keyword for fireteam cores, which is the most important in Invincible Army, and you will typically at least start with, in your journey down the Invincible Army path, an Invincible core as the basis of many of your lists. And that will start with, well, you have a selection of troops that are considered invincibles, but you will usually have at least some Zuyong Invincibles in that link. Not for nothing are they the line troops of the Invincible Army. They will often form kind of like the basis of that core, and 2 or 3 of them in an Invincibles core is very serviceable. And they have a few things about them that are sort of like quite attractive. The first is, for heavy infantry, this is a surprisingly, let's say, like optimized stat profile. They are not overpaying for Fizz, just Fizz 12, which is enough if you're paramedicing something, and that's all. Only Armor 3 and BTS 3, which helps keeps the cost of the profiles down. 6-2 move, which isn't particularly expensive. And that produces an overall trooper, this is still 13, that produces an overall trooper where you are paying 26 points for the basic combi rifle profile, and not terribly much more for other Zuyong profiles until we start adding attractive rules and equipment that actually is expensive enough to justify that cost. And that makes them, look, nothing that starts at 26 points is truly an economy piece, but other factions might pay that many points for single wound infantry, and Zuyong are Armor 3, BTS 3 with 2 wounds. The other rule about them that is actually surprisingly important is the fact that they have number 2, and that is why I would recommend not leaving home without some of them in your heavy infantry core. Number two is a rule that a lot of the time is sort of like not a big deal. It doesn't come up that often, but it actually matters for Zuyong Invincibles. What number two does is if a fire team is broken and you have a trooper with number two in the link, that trooper just becomes the link team leader and the team does not break. And that is a big deal because the Oblivion program exists and isolates troopers. And if you isolate a link leader, the link would normally break. And Zuyong Invincible link teams are almost always going to have a hackable link leader, which means that having your link leader Oblivioned under normal circumstances, if you aren't, say, a Morat, would break the link. Zuyongs don't have access to that many veteran troops, but they have access to number two in their links, which they use to keep link teams intact and able to continue to move forward or defend, even if the link gets isolated or members of the link get isolated. Now, you will obviously still lose link bonuses as your link becomes smaller, but there is a huge difference between having the link completely stopped and having in ARO losing all of your link bonuses entirely, or in active turn having to stop and spend a command token, which is a limited resource. There's a big difference between that and being able to just carry on, albeit with a member down because his comms have been turned off by some nomad hacker somewhere. The rule is actually genuinely valuable and is the first part of a mix that will help you weather some of the storm against enemy hacking. The other thing that will help that is the fact that Invincible Army generally, and Zuyong Invincibles in particular, are packing Tinbot with Firewall -6. This is the highest firewall you can get in the game. It will impose a whopping -6 to enemy hacking attacks against you and other comms attacks, which makes, among other things, Invincible Army one of the nightmare armies for Toha Ferroware based lists to play against, because trying to Ferroware someone through a -6 penalty is very difficult. And you should give serious consideration to including a Tinbot profile in any of your heavy infantry links. Now, against a really dedicated attack, it will not necessarily save you, and particularly if you are forced to move through a repeater network where there are 3 enemy hackers, for example, all taking AROs, it is only going to go so far. But if your opponent is running like a Pan-Oceanian list with a single Fusilier as their hacking presence, you can seriously consider risking AROs against a piece like that. And if your opponent is trying to hack you in active, for example, trying to spotlight a model to missile it, trying to spotlight someone when you have a -6 penalty to your whip roll makes even combined army hackers kind of want to try something else in the first instance. And so, for this reason, from amongst this sea of profiles, the pieces that I recommend starting with, firstly, are the Tactical Awareness Combi Rifle 10-Bot Firewall -6. 31 points is a little expensive, but this is one of the only 0 SWC Tactical Awareness heavy infantry kind of like just in the game. Like other factions that might be able to otherwise compete with order count washed through a heavy infantry link team still fall behind Zuyong Invincibles and Invincible Army generally, because basically every other tactical awareness heavy infantry is gated in some way behind an SWC cost, usually SWC weapon. Zero Invincibles have a 0 SWC tactical awareness option that you'll often want to put in links. You should also consider the paramedic. Because you're running a heavy infantry link team, you are going to have reasonably high fizz, models with shock immune, they're often going to go unconscious rather than die, and having a linked paramedic, and it will be linked because you have number 2 in the list, having a linked paramedic to recover models right there and then if they do go unconscious, that can be very valuable as well. Now, in terms of SWC weapons, the Tactical Awareness Heavy Machine Gun as another tactical awareness piece at a reasonable cost is definitely an option, although we're going to talk about Shang-Chi next, and in Zuyong, in Invincible fire teams, you will often consider taking a Shang-Chi as the spearhead, as the tip of the, the big gun. But the Zuyong Tactical Awareness HMG is definitely an option. And then finally, the Humble Boarding Shotgun is worth considering. Boarding shotguns on heavy infantry with big bonuses get some weird things that they do to math when you round a corner and the combination of link and range bonuses are putting you at ballistic skill 22. That is a staggeringly dangerous attack made outside of close combat. It is very, very rare to get ballistic skill modifiers that exceed 20. and you get that bonus to your dice roll. On a burst 3 gun, there is almost nothing that you are not a threat to. The only reason why you wouldn't take the boarding shotgun Zuyong as like just a regular piece is that you'll usually only have 5 models in a link, and there are many other pieces that will be really competing for slots, and ultimately there might just be some other piece, for example a Shang-Chi, that has a shotgun instead. But if you were trying maybe a lower points Zuyong Invincible link, like you're running either a lighter Zuyong link or a smaller points game, the boarding shotgun Zuyong is something I would seriously consider. Now, from the discount Zuyong, we go to their considerably upmarket cousin, the Shang-Chi Invincibles. Now, for what it's worth, my personal take is that these are some of the most overhyped models in the entire game, because you will occasionally see people touting these as the be-all and end-all, just super soldier pieces, which I think you need to take with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, Shang-Chi Invincibles are only Ballistic Skill 13, same as a regular Zuyong Invincible. They pay a lot of points for a whole bunch of ancillary upgrades that don't actually significantly impact their ability to win a face-to-face roll. But some of those upgrades are very worthwhile. Now, stuff that is bloating the points cost out, higher close combat, more fizz, more armor, more BTS, those are all nice to have, but they aren't necessarily always worthwhile, and they are going to increase the points cost of the unit. However, what is nice is ballistic skill attack shock just on everything, and some of the upgun profiles you get in the Shang-Chi Invincible team. Most notable of which are our tactical awareness profiles, in particular our big guns, the standout of which is the AP heavy machine gun with chain colt and tinbot firewall. And this guy is a big deal mostly because of those armor-piercing rounds. These will be armor-piercing and shock because he has ballistic skill attack shock as a base, and although he is no better at winning a face-to-face roll than a regular Zuyong Invincible with heavy machine gun, those armor-piercing rounds make all of the difference when you are trying to do something like dislodge an enemy heavy tag. Also very attractive for my money is the Heavy Rocket Launcher Light Shotgun Tactical Awareness model. This is coming in at only 38 points for a tactical awareness model with a interesting long-range weapon and a light shotgun for close assault. That is a shock heavy rocket launcher and a shock light shotgun, just for example. But basically that weapon profile, heavy rocket launcher and light shotgun, is normally relatively cheap, and it does help keep the cost of this tactical awareness Shang-Chi down below the exorbitant near 50s that you will see on some of these other pieces. Now, otherwise, I'm going to generally suggest you probably avoid most of these other Shang-Chi profiles, and the reason for that just is that the damn things are incredibly expensive. You want to be very judicious including Shang-Chi in your links, because you are already taking lots of heavy infantry, lots of expensive models in this faction, and that means if we want to bulk the army out and actually have redundancy, multiple pieces, a second combat group that does anything, we need to cut costs here and there where we can. So, for example, I would not ever suggest you take a Shang-Chi paramedic. Yes, it has a multi-rifle, yes, it has a chain colt, but it is ultimately still doing all of the same stuff as the Zuyong Invincible paramedic. But it costs 38 points when the Zuyong paramedic costs 28 points. And paying that 10-point premium for effectively nothing that is actually seriously impacting the unit's ability to perform the role. Its whip is the same for doing specialist things, its ballistic skill is the same, it's got number 2, it's going to stay in a link team, etc. You are paying 10 points for some armor, some BTS, a multi-rifle but also ballistic skill attack shock, and the chain colt. Like, these aren't bad upgrades, but we're going to need to save points as we build lists in this faction, and that means not splurging on Shang-Chi when we could take a Zuyong to do the same job. But we can't access AP firepower at long range in the regular Zuyong link. I mean, yes, the missile launcher, but there's no AP HMG. There is an AP HMG Shang-Chi, and for that reason we will take that kind of a piece pretty often. Shang-Chi complement Zuyong Invincibles very nicely and vice versa, but Shang-Chi do not replace Zuyong Invincibles. Now, with our Zuyong Invincibles and our Shang-Chi Invincibles forming the basis of our big link team, We're going to start spicing it up with our collection of super friends. There are a number of characters that we're going to go through now, all of which count as invincibles for purposes of composition bonuses and add some interesting and powerful things to a link. And we're going to start with Tai Sheng Zuyong Invincibles NCO. Now, a few things to note about her. Okay, firstly, she is expensive. My preferred profile is the Mark 12, sometimes the Breaker Combi, but we'll usually be getting our tin bots elsewhere. So the Mark 12 adds a nice 24-inch range gun to a link, then that is a whopping 40 points. However, I'm going to make the argument that she is worth those 40 points, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, she's Ballistic Skill 14, and there are not a lot of Ballistic Skill 14 models in this army, particularly that can join links. In a core link, she's going to be Ballistic Skill 17 Burst 4 with a damage 15 weapon, which is frankly really good, and it's a 0 SWC weapon if you're constrained on SWC, etc. She is just a competent and serviceable addition to any Zuyong link, and she's a forward observer and whip 14, which makes her one of the highest willpower specialists in the faction as well. However, setting aside all of that, the reason why you will typically take either her or this next character that we're going to look at, Crit Cockram, is because she is an NCO. And NCO is the second part, alongside Tactical Awareness, of how we get those huge order counts on Zuyong Invincible links. We will see in a little bit a Lieutenant +1 order profile that is relatively affordable, and so having an NCO effectively adds 2 more orders that can be spent on a Zuyong Invincible link team, and that's how we start reaching those 14, 15, or even 16 orders that might be spent on a link. And that justifies some of the cost of Tai Sheng. She's mostly worthwhile just all on her own merits. I like the profile, I like the things that she's doing. She is expensive, but the expense in this case is worthwhile. You're going often to want to take either her or Crit Cockram, Zuyong Invincibles Specialist. Now, a lot of the same things that I said about Tai Sheng, you can apply to Crit Cockram. He's a Whip 14 Specialist. In this case, he's an Engineer. Now, Engineer is kind of uniquely useful because all of those things that I mentioned about Zuyongs getting hacked and being hackable, you can feasibly undo with an Engineer. Now, you never want to stop and take multiple orders off, trying to recover things, trying to remove statuses from your troops, but having the option to do so is genuinely worthwhile. And Crit Cockram, like Tai Sheng, is an NCO, which means that he can add those orders to the link team. And in Crit's case, he can do so kind of more cheaply than Tai Sheng can, or adding a bigger gun than she can, which is kind of attractive. Now, his choices, there is a forward deployment profile that can't join the link. It isn't an FTO. It can join its own kind of link alongside a Hulong Shop Trooper, but we're going to relegate that one kind of to the spice. It's not part of the big Invincible core question. I actually do not mind at all his boarding shotgun forward deployment profile. I think it's super cool. It is mine layer deploying EM mines. It's got forward deployment +8. It's got a boarding shotgun. It's also a whopping 41 points. Consider it if you're doing something spicy or interesting with your list, but for purposes of this conversation, we're typically going to be looking usually at the multi-rifle +1 damage. Now, that is only 16-inch range, unlike 24-inch with Tai Sheng's Mark 12, but it's a multi-rifle +1 damage, so you're going to be firing damage 14 AP rounds. Crit Cockram's ballistic skill is only 13, it's not 14, unlike Tai Sheng, so he's going to be a slightly worse face-to-face roll. But he is an Engineer where she's just a forward observer. He is still whip 14 and he's only 36 points. So if you want to trim a few points and have the ability to do things like remove isolated from your invincibles if they get caught out, Crit Cockram is an excellent choice. I wouldn't double up. I wouldn't take Crit or Tai Sheng or this next trooper that we're going to be looking at, Bishia, but one of those is a very good call. The third and final NCO that you can add to an Invincibles link and still have it considered as an Invincible Trooper is Bishia. I believe that's how it's pronounced, the Jade Champion. Now, Bishia, she's a relatively recent, I think she's the most recent addition, potentially, to Invincible Army. She is one of my favorite profiles that is still actually just kind of a little bit difficult to add to links, and that is just because her ability to free run almost makes her more worthwhile having her solo, because she has that combination of super jump and climbing plus. For those who aren't aware, super jump works very poorly in link teams unless the entire link has super jump. And that's because it changes jump to a short skill, which the rest of the link can't declare jump as a short skill. Climbing Plus works very well because it's just your normal movement can now move up walls, but be aware of that limitation if you choose to include her. Otherwise, she is more expensive than either Crit Cockram or Sora Quan, but not much more expensive. And what you get is you get a forward observer, lower willpower than either of her two competitors, but she's still an NCO. She has just a regular multi-rifle, but she has a multispectral visor level 1, which is otherwise surprisingly absent from the pieces we would typically put in a core link. And she has genuinely good close combat at CC22, EMCCW with Martial Arts 3, and Stealth. Now, Stealth is only going to get you so far in terms of doing things like unpicking repeaters on rooftops, because sooner or later you're going to have to break Stealth to attack. But in terms of another option that you have to just try and get through enemy hacking networks, Bishia can be added to that toolkit. Now, I usually wouldn't have her alongside Crit Cockram, for example, because they're both NCOs. You really only want one in a core link. But we are starting to see now the roundedness of options that Invincible Army have for dealing with enemy hacking arrows. We have the tin bots. We have number 2, so that the links can't easily be broken. We have an engineer, if we want to recover status effects inflicted by hacking. And then finally, we have Bishia, who has the ability to do things like get up onto rooftops and take shots against repeaters or Masai Morans, etc. from ideally outside hacking net area, but worst case scenario, she can at least close in on and destroy those hacking ARO generating pieces to allow the rest of the link to advance. And so for that reason, I'm going to recommend that either Sora Quan or Crit Cockram or Bishia be one of the first models you add to any Invincible Army core link, because they all provide that incredibly valuable NCO skill, and then they each all also bring along something very valuable to the link that it otherwise doesn't have. In Sora Quan's case, we have a Whip 14 specialist and good 24-inch range gunfighting with actually surprisingly good ballistic skill. In Crit Cockram's place, we have a Whip 14 specialist and the ability to engineer yourself out of damage inflicted by hacking. And then in Bishia's case, we have mobility and close combat and stealth, all of which are very valuable tools. And so that leaves us with an Invincible Army link team, usually looking something like one character and a couple of regular Zuyong Invincibles, and then one or two Shang-Chi Invincibles, which gives you in total, it's expensive, it's very expensive, but affordable and powerful and an absolute ton of orders as the core of our Invincible Army list in this big 5-person link. Now, not every Invincible Army list can or should be using that. There are other ways to play the faction, but the power fantasy really starts there, and it's what I'll be focusing on and what we will see in the list at the end of this episode. Now, the last model just to talk about, there are actually a couple more models that can join and still count as Invincibles. One of them is Queen Gao, but he is bad, so we're going to ignore him. A consideration that you will think about from time to time is Lei Gong, Invincible's Lord of Thunder. Now, Albedo is not a good skill, and it is very expensive. We are not taking Lei Gong for Albedo. We are taking Lei Gong because he's medium infantry. He still has no wound incapacitation and shock, so he's almost heavy infantry, but he's not hackable, which means that whichever of these two profiles you take, look, frankly, both of them are more expensive than a Zuyong, and for that reason, I'm not often going to recommend him. Chain of Command is just not particularly valuable in Invincibles because you'll usually just take a Dao Ying Lieutenant and it will hide under camouflage at the back of the table and never die. But sometimes you just need an unhackable dude, and Lei Gong is an unhackable dude, and that is worth considering. In fact, he is literally the only model in the entire faction that might maybe be able to meaningfully prosecute an offense that is not hackable. It's him. He's the only one. If we sort this entire faction by hackable status, he's the only one that's not hackable and who might do something, unless we're doing something like taking multiple Dao Ying and YOLOing them out of the deployment zone. And so, for that reason, he deserves consideration from time to time, even if all he's packing is a multispectral Vital Level 1 shock marksman rifle, which is really just a glorified combi rifle. It's not a good gun, it's not dangerous, not particularly, but the man is not hackable, and that matters some of the time. Now, for all of my talk about Zuyong Invincibles being the line troops of Invincible Army, it is worth just bearing a thought toward Zan Shi. At 11 points, Zhanshi are on the expensive side for line infantry. They are 1 point more than most factions would pay for their line infantry, and for that they get +1 dodge, which is almost never relevant on a troop like this. But 11 points is still 11 points. They are just line infantry. You can take up to 5 of them, and they can form both a core and a Haris team. And for that reason, you will often consider taking Zhanshi in something like perhaps a Haris, because we can add to them various wildcards that make them kind of credible as a link team. It'll just be a support role. It's not going to be something that you'll yeet forward across the table because these are just line troops, unless you have to do something like desperately try to unpick an enemy repeater network that you do not think you can approach with a heavy infantry corps, in which case you might choose to move your Zhanshi out. Otherwise, I consider Zhanshi as able support elements, but they are genuinely able support elements. Things like the paramedic and hacker, even just the generic combi rifle for an extra order, help fill out the broader Zuyong Invincible army. And for that reason, they shouldn't be discounted. They can add a lot of utility, really, as support pieces, and for that reason, you should consider including them as support elements in, I think, honestly, quite a lot of Invincible armies. And in terms of link teams, because they just form Harry's teams or cores, you can add wildcards to them, which is not going to produce the same high watermark power of the big heavy infantry core, but when all you need is just a secondary support element, you genuinely can get quite a lot of work out of doing things like adding, for example, that APHMG Shang-Chi to a Zhanshi team. The combination of, let's say, a Zhanshi hacker, a Zhanshi paramedic, and a Shang-Chi APHMG. The Shang-Chi makes it very, very expensive, but you have a Burst 5 APHMG, a paramedic behind it, and a hacker benefiting from a Tinbot -6. That is okay, look, frankly, that's something that you can do in White Banner, and if you like that, consider playing White Banner. But as a support element to back up something like the big Invincible core, or to be the starting point for a different way of playing Invincibles, that is something genuinely to consider. After Shang-Chi, the other piece that you want to seriously consider as wildcards into a Zhanshi core, sorry, is the Haidao Special Support Group, in particular the MSV2 multi-sniper rifle. Now, Haidao are a model that have had high highs and low lows over the course of their life, and which ultimately have been somewhat undone by the N4 changes to link teams because Haidao don't count as invincibles for the purposes of Invincible Army fire teams, which means that if you put one into one of the big cores, you are effectively giving everyone -2 ballistic skill. But in a smaller team, Haidao add actually a lot of value. And there are a couple of profiles that are really relevant here. In fact, there are two profiles. There are two profiles that are really relevant here. The first is the MSV2 multi-sniper in just like a support firepower team. 33 points for a Armor 3, Shock Immune, No Wound Incap model, Ballistic Skill 13. That is frankly affordable, and sometimes you just need an MSV2 gun, whether it's to be an ARO piece against impending Bearpode assault, or to have something that gives you a shot of dislodging like a cutter, for example, or another high mimetism piece that's on ARO. The Hideout helps meet that need, and it meets it affordably by doing things like just joining a team of Zhanshi, who will very effectively force multiply it. The Killer Hacker is relevant because it's, I think, the only Killer Hacker in the entire faction. And that's a pretty big deal. Now, as far as killer hackers go, it's not outstanding, but also, frankly, it's only 24 points. And for 24 points, you do have to bear up under the weight of BTS 0, which is not an ideal stat on a hacker, but it is still a shock immune, no wound incap troop with a boarding shotgun and ballistic skill 13, which makes it serviceable for other use. And just having a killer hacker is the final piece in that. How do we potentially solve hacking with this army? Now, yes, you can put the Hideout in a link team alongside Tinbot -6, and that actually makes it, admittedly expensive, that makes it a surprisingly capable I will go and fight enemy hackers. Like that example of the Fusilier, the Whip 12 Fusilier, who is the only Pan-Oceanian hacker, hanging out behind a bunch of Fugazis. That Fusilier fears the Hideout. The Hideout will put him down, particularly if it's combined with its own Tinbot, to enable it to just face-check something like a Peacemaker repeater and kill the enemy Fusilier from long distance. What the hideout can't do is go up against dedicated multiple enemy hackers. If your opponent has 2 or 3 enemy hackers, you cannot risk face checking a enemy repeater network except in the most dire of circumstances. But you can work around that. You can use your orders to maneuver the link team, get around, go the long way if you need to, go around enemy hacking defenses, and then pounce on enemy hackers wherever they are hiding. And just having that option significantly opens up certain lines of play for Invincibles, even if it is not always easy to include a hideout. Particularly if you're committed to a full Invincible core, it's difficult to find a way to slot this guy in, but consider, remember that it exists and seriously consider it, for example, in a tournament pair. If you were dedicated to running Invincible Army at an event, you would consider Hideout as, firstly, just access to a serviceable hacker for specialist bonuses, but secondly, having something that can help you push through those matchups where otherwise just 1 or 2 weak enemy hackers would be such a problem. The Hideout can help answer that. And now, the very last model that I would say is not necessarily an auto-include, but one of the pieces that really forms the baseline of the faction is the Dao Ying Operative Control Unit. In my Yu Cheng faction focus, I mentioned this guy, and everything I said about him applies here. This is a model that is an excellent lieutenant. It is Whip 14, it sits under camouflage in the deployment zone. Because it's in a marker state, it's very hard to attack, and it has Lieutenant +1 order for very cheap. If you want to maximize the effect of your NCOs, then taking a Dao Ying gives you the extra lieutenant order that will enable you to do that, to enable Tai Sheng, Crit Cockram, and Bishia to spend not just 1 but 2 lieutenant orders activating a link team, and yeah, Dao Ying operative control units. Now, whether or not you like basically any of the LT profiles is a matter of personal preference. I would usually start with the cheapest one, but you can also go the hacker or even the sniper. Some of the time it will be a big deal. Late in the game, having the option to activate that multi-sniper lieutenant and take some shots is something that you can seriously consider. Although I rarely have the points, and in trying to build lists for Invincible Army to showcase at the end of the episode, finding those extra 12 points is not an easy thing to do. The other thing to consider Dao Ying for is that they are availability 3 in Invincible Army, and those 22 and 27 point Dao Ying, they are not exactly skirmishers because they do not have infiltration. They start in your deployment zone. But alongside Lei Gong, they are the only other unit in the entire faction that is not hackable. Well, I mean, obviously the hacker is hackable, but they are under a marker state, and they are not heavy infantry. You might consider having them in armies just as attack pieces. They won't benefit from tactical awareness, they won't benefit from NCO, they will just be spending their own orders, but they can categorically cross the table under a hacking network thanks to that marker state and thanks to stealth, and actually do something that your Invincible Link team might not. Now, 22 points for a model that is doing that is not unreasonable if you just have the orders to move it forward. I don't see many Invincible lists that try something like this, but it is something that's worth considering as part of the overall force mix, particularly if you step away from the full 5-person fire team as the basis of the faction and start exploring more diversified independent assets. I feel like Dao Ying might have a little bit of a role to play in that mix, although realistically their core role is to be a lieutenant +1 order in a faction with great linkable NCOs. Now, everything we've covered so far is what I would say is the core of the faction alongside, meat and potatoes stuff like flash pulse remotes to bulk out your order pool. Everything from here on out is the spice, the stuff that you might flex into or experiment with. But one of the nice things about Invincible Army, and then kind of vanilla Yu Ching by extension, is that a lot of this stuff is actually surprisingly cool and viable. Really, there's nothing wrong with the profiles, it's just a question of what you can afford, and the answer is often not a lot of it. But there's really nothing wrong with these profiles, they're pretty cool, and that starts with the Lu Xing Jump Infantry. Now, yes, you absolutely can run a meme list with these guys, taking 4 of them, but ultimately what this guy is just a surprisingly competent drop troop. He's got ballistic skill 13, he lands on a 14, which is surprisingly rare, so you don't necessarily need to take an Evo hacker to back him up, although you can. He's got shock immune, no wind incapacitation with totally serviceable stats, and that specialist operative multi-rifle at 35 points is, 1, frankly affordable, and 2, very well serviceable, very well conditioned and apportioned to create breaches, because that 16-inch range band is where you start being able to do things like, for example, shoot repeaters from outside of their repeater area, and on a model that you can position with precision on the table is a big deal. Now, yes, the Lushing has Explode. Explode is a meme. Sometimes it will do something cool, but much more of the time what the Lushing is about is landing with surprising accuracy and accomplishing things either mission-oriented with Specialist Operative or with that D-Charge. It's a veteran troop and it's HI, so it can do a lot of classifieds, and that multi-rifle is bringing AP or shock rounds on time, on target to some very important parts of the table. I have seen one game absolutely broken open by a Lushing just landing behind a tag that could not guts into cover and just wearing away at it from inside 16 inches. And then there were some very unfortunate repair rolls the next turn, but we won't talk about that. Just all of this was off the back of an opening that the Lushing created and then exploited. It's a surprisingly cool piece. In a similar vein, we have both the Zensha and Hulang shock troopers. The Zensha is relatively practical. It is still, it's expensive. It's very expensive. But the boarding shotgun profiles in particular, I know people like submachine guns, but genuinely I recommend the boarding shotgun. You can do a lot of work with a template on a heavy infantry model, particularly a heavy infantry model with climbing plus and camouflage. Although I wouldn't want to use the Zensha to try and do things like kill enemy repeaters or Masai Morans, because boarding shotgun, you can push through those repeater areas and do things like go after link teams, and it's just a solid piece. Again, it's going to be very difficult to afford the Zensha with any regularity in Invincible Army because so many of the other pieces are so expensive, and for that reason I consider her to be primarily a dash-out company piece, but she's solid and worth investigating in some lists. And perhaps not as practical, but far more stylish, is the Hulang Shock Trooper. Now, the Hulang is a forward-deploying troop most of the time that lacks a marker state, but has Mimetism -6, which is a big deal. And there is one particular profile that I genuinely kind of like there, which is yes, it's a submachine gun, but it's a submachine gun +1 burst with EM grenades, decharges, crazy koalas, mine layers, and forward deployment. Now, look, this guy is expensive. Again, the reason why I like this guy is that I've played him in Dash Out Company, where you can actually afford him because you are just absolutely full to brim of cheap troops. But a Crazy Koala, the ability to move forward and deploy that, maybe as part of an attack run so that there is a deployable weapon ready to trigger, and EM grenades, and a Mimetism 6 Ballistic Skill 12 Burst 4 submachine gun, is it's cool. It does really solid things if you can just maneuver it into range and on target. Now, frankly, it's probably too expensive to take in 99% of Invincible Army lists, but it's very cool. And this is the part of the video where we're talking about the very cool thing, and I think the Hulang Shock Trooper is pretty cool. Mimetism 6, martial arts, decent close combat, multi-filament CCWs, good close range weapons, and Mine Layer and the Crazy Koala has done work for me in the past, although, admittedly, not work in Invincible Army, work in Dash Out Company. Finally, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, there's a lot of solid stuff if you can just afford it in Yujing. I haven't talked about Haktao, but I think they're cool. I haven't talked about Moang, I think they're cool. Haven't talked about the Guija, I think it's surprisingly viable in this faction if you can find a slot for it. We're going to finish on the Yan Ho Invincibles, who have, look, yes, as always, you have the wonderful HRMC, one of my favorite weapons in the game, but the Yan Ho is linkable in Invincibles. Now, should you link it? Probably not, if we're being perfectly honest. It's very expensive, but it is linkable in a Haris team. There are two profiles that you can link. The first is the multi-HMG, which would be just a build your own HRMC, except that the ability to fire explosive rounds in ARO at burst 2 is actually pretty relevant. Or we have the missile launcher +1 burst. Now, there are two things to note about that. The first is that gives you a burst 3 missile launcher at ballistic skill 14 in your active turn, which is not messing around in terms of the threat that it presents. Like, I would not put anything up against that in ARO unless it was disposable, because 3 shots on 14s is going to connect, and any missile that connects will do terrible damage. And burst 2 in ARO missile launchers are very scary and dangerous. Now, the challenge, of course, is finding something to wildcard into the Zuyong link, because you probably don't want to link multiple Zuyongs. You want to try and find some wildcards, but there are a few options, including, for example, a Pangalong, that is the fat robot, which is on screen now and has a 12-point repeater light shotgun option. Worst case scenario, you just take two of these guys, staple them to that Yanhuo, and you have light shotgun border guards. Maybe you've got quick cot ram to recover them if they go down, but 12 points is only one more point than a Zhanchi. The only problem with the Pangalong is that they're on Silhouette 4 bases, so they can be hard to physically deploy because they are so large, but otherwise, nothing wrong with that as a wild card to add into a link team to give our Yanhuos the link team bonuses. Would this be a meme link? Yeah, it would, a little bit. Could you consider using it? Yeah, you could, a little bit, because a Burst 3 missile launcher or a multi-HMG that is Burst 5 inactive and Burst 2 explosive in reactive is a genuinely kind of credible and serious threat, something that you can consider using. And now, just to round out this particular faction focus, as always, we'll be looking at a sample Invincible list, and there we have one on screen now. Now, this is what I would call a very classic Yuching Invincibles full heavy many orders core. It's also worth noting that, again, to repeat, I am not an Invincible Army player. You can probably optimize this with even a little bit of experience with the faction. This is very much a first time, first try attempt that I would run if I was looking to play Invincible Army tomorrow, which I'm not. But the list is solid and is scary and is doing that big obvious strength that I've spent so much time talking about. So what do we have? Well, we start with a Daoying Lieutenant, so we have +1 order. Then we have a 5-person heavy infantry link consisting of Tai Sheng, a Shangji HRL light shotgun tack-aware model, a Shangji APHMG chain colt tack-aware model, a Zuyong tack-aware tinbot model, and a Zuyong paramedic, which means that this link team can spend 15 orders through a combination of available regular orders, NCO orders spending the 2 lieutenant orders, and the 3 tack-aware orders. You could theoretically get a 4 tactical awareness model in there, but that would mean cutting the paramedic, and I think the paramedic is worthwhile. And frankly, if you can't make something happen with 15 orders on a link team, you are not going to make it happen with 16 orders. As we discussed at the beginning of the episode, one of the ways, like how you want to play a link team like this, is you want to reserve some of those orders. Like usually spend the tack-aware and the NCO orders first, but set aside some regular orders to pull this link team back at the end of the turn. Set aside 3 or even 4. You will have them available, right? You will have enough orders to do that. Pull this link team back to a defensible position every turn. Treat it like you would a tag or some other equally valuable piece, because this link is the bulk of your entire army. Supporting it, we've got a Flash Pulse bot, and then we have a 3-person link team. That is the Zhanchi and Haidao combination that I mentioned. So we have the Haidao MSV2 multi-sniper rifle, been a Harry's team with a Zhanchi hacker and a Zhanchi combi rifle. That hacker, I think, actually has a fair bit of potential in this particular list. Again, we have 2 Chang'ai Yaokongs and a Weibing Yaokong, so those are 3 repeaters in our deployment zone, which means that in terms of defense, we have a little bit of hacking defense. And we have spoken throughout this video about what even a little bit of hacking defense can do against certain kinds of attacks. If someone is coming after us with a tag, someone wants to try and run a Sphinx into our deployment zone, for example, having just one Whip 13 hacker and good repeater coverage can make all of the difference. So I've put one in this list. In Combat Group 2, we have a very thin, pure support combat group. We have a Warcore, a Flash Pulse bot, and a Forward Observer remote. Now, the main purpose of this group is that the Warcore is a disposable ARO piece, and we will probably be moving these pieces into the main combat group to preserve our orders over the course of the game, so we stay at that big high order count for that big core. But early in the game, don't discount the possibility of that Forward Observer remote. There's 2 things in particular that it can do. The first is it can move its way forward over the course of a game to accomplish some specialist objectives that you might not otherwise do with your main link, because it can be on one part of the table and your link can be on the other. But the other reason why it's potentially valuable in this list is sensor. Having a model that can just very effectively discover and unpick camouflage markers and just clear the way, that is valuable support, even if you're just making discover rolls at a +6 from sensor with the waybeing as it moves forward. Having that as a piece to do things like discover enemy camouflage markers, enemy Dalami, for example, in the midfield, having a trooper that can do that, discover Helot, stuff like that, having a trooper that can do that in combat group 2 to just open up nice, clean ballistic skill, like move, shoot, ballistic skill attacks with the Zuyong and Shang-Chi team, I think has some merit. And frankly, it's a 15-point trooper and we needed to cut costs. It's cheap enough that we can include in a list. And so there you go. That is the faction focus for the Invincible army. As always, I hope you enjoyed this. If you'd like to support the channel, as a reminder, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. If you'd like to request an army for the next faction focus, or an army to be covered in battle reports, it's through those means that I take requests. And if you'd like to see something featured on the channel, that's how to ask for it. In terms of videos that we've got coming up, probably the next thing will be a faction focus. I'm looking to cover the Caledonian Highlander army, another channel viewer request. And we may get some battle reports in around that, although most of my game time has frankly been focused on Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree recently, and otherwise preparing for a Conquest Worlds qualifier event which is happening in Canberra next month. So that's been most of my spare gaming time, not quite as much Infinity. I also have a request to cover some military orders content at some point in future, but Lord knows how I'm going to do that because I bounce off military orders even harder than I bounce off of Invincible Army. As always, though, I hope very much that you enjoyed this. It was interesting to write and to make, and I will see you next time.